When I was a child growing up in Kenton and Newcastle, I didn't know that Dr. Martin Luther King had visited Newcastle, and I didn't know that there had been African soldiers garrisoned on Hadrian's Wall. I didn't know that people who looked like me had played such a part in our history, and that I had that share in our shared history, and my childhood and those of my friends was poorer for it. That is why I am so pleased that the North Shields Heritology Project are looking to celebrate the stories of two black men with close ties to North Shields. American abolitionist Frederick Douglass came to Newcastle in the 19th century, and his legal freedom was bought with money raised by Newcastle Quakers. Douglass visited North Shields in 1860, 5 years before the American Civil War ended slavery, and the connection between Douglass and the Northeast lives on to inspire the fight for equality and justice in our region. Charles Minto arrived in North Shields in the 1920s. He was a boxer who fought for the safety of West Indian soldiers based in North Shields, setting up the Colonial House Hostel on Northumberland Street. These stories are part of our shared heritage. They're part of the story of the Northeast, and something of which we should all be proud. And to be proud, we have to know about them.
North Shields, a port in northeast England, founded on fishing 800 years ago, and still fishing to this day. The town developed from one road that ran alongside the river. As time passed, it became known as Low Town, or Low Street, but its adoptive name was the Street of All Nations, a community drawn from the four corners of the globe, united by two things, the sea and poverty. Inside this ethnic mosaic neighbourhood, bounded by the Tyne on one side and a steep bank on the other, tolerance took hold and grew. Although there are several buildings within the North Shields Heritage Action Zone with a connection to black history, our aim is to focus on just two. The Baptist Church on Howard Street and number 3 Northumberland Place. The buildings are also connected to the stories of two black men. Here we look at Frederick Douglass, a slave born at the early part of the 19th century, who rose to become one of the leaders of the abolitionist movement in America at that time. And later, the other story that we'll look at is of Charles Udor Minto, a boxing champion from Nigeria, born at the end of the 19th century. Both were concerned with the welfare of their race, and both would realise their aims and purpose as a consequence of war. But what drew these men from such distant places to the small town of North Shields? Well, we've already mentioned the influence of the sea, but there was another equally important factor. The Shields Quaker community set up their first meeting house in 1698 at the Bullring in what would later become part of Lowtown. Their movement's dedication and commitment to equality and community led many Quakers to become social activists. Their influence on the town, both socially and politically, was significant.
It's of little surprise then that Shields refused to look the other way to the practice of slavery. The North Shields Anti-Slavery Society set out its founding resolutions at a public meeting convened here at the site of the old Wesleyan Chapel, Howard Street, on the 21st of October 1836. The prominent local Quaker, Robert Spence, who lived on the street, acted as its first chair.
North Shields also boasted two delegates to the World Anti-Slavery Convention in 1840, held in London, with more than 500 abolitionists from Canada to Mauritius attending. It was because of this recognised activism in the promotion of the anti-slavery movement that North Shields played host to a number of the key 19th century abolitionists, including William Wells Brown, Henry Highland Garnet, and George Thompson, and of course the most noted of them all, and the first of the two men in our story, Frederick Douglass. Douglass was a self-educated former slave, an imposing figure who bore the scars of many brutal lashings. He escaped bondage at the age of 20, eventually purchasing his freedom for $711.66, somewhere in the region of £25,000 today. The money was raised by Ellen and Anna Richardson, two Newcastle Quakers and anti-slavery activists. That was in 1846, the same year he visited North Shields, not once but twice in the same number of months. Douglass, as well as being a noted anti-slavery activist, wrote numerous books and was an extremely powerful orator. As a leader in the abolitionist movement, he went on to become what some describe as the most influential black man in 19th century America. He was also a champion for women's rights, a brilliant strategist, a newspaper owner, and friend to Abraham Lincoln, who said of Douglass, "There is no man in the country whose opinion I value more."
As part of a 20-month trip around the UK, Frederick Douglass gave 3 addresses in the northeast area in August 1846, 2 in Newcastle and the other here in North Shields. However, unusually, he returned to Shields to give a second address a month later.
There is no record as regards the content of his address, but it is likely to have followed the major themes of many of his speeches during this period. His early life as a slave, the moral wickedness and inhumanity of slavery, its centrality to the American political, economic and social system, and, most importantly, his view that slavery was an evil that beset all mankind.
We know that the Baptist church on both occasions was filled by a highly respectable audience. But who exactly occupied the pews on those 2 evenings is not known. However, in all likelihood, the Quaker community would have been well represented. Certainly part of the Spence family who lived in Howard Street must have been in attendance. But was there a Mrs. Blythe in the audience on either of those 2 occasions? If so, she would easily have identified with the famous speaker's early account of his life, as it pretty much mirrored her own.
Mrs. Mary Ann Blythe, or Matcham as she was known at the time of her arrival in North Shields in 1831, escaped from slavery in Richmond, Virginia. Like Douglass, she was supported in her escape from bondage by the Quakers, and worked as an employee to various members of the Spence family until she married a local man, James Blythe, in 1841. She lived at 57 Howard Street at the time of Frederick Douglass's visits, which was located roughly opposite the Baptist chapel. It is likely that she would have been a regular worshipper at the church, where she was believed to have been baptized. Was she introduced to the famous man at some point during his visits? It's intriguing to believe that events did conspire to bring together, however briefly, 2 people with a shared experience of being regarded as the property of another human being and escaping from that condition. Did they meet? We can only speculate. Frederick Douglass made his final visit to North Shields on the 23rd of February 1860, just over a year before the beginning of the American Civil War, which he must have known was coming at that time. The ratification of the 13th Amendment on the 31st of January 1865 brought an end to slavery in America, at least on paper. But for Douglass, the fight was only beginning, as his focus then shifted to agitation over civil rights for the ex-slaves, which he continued to press for until his death in 1895. The Douglass-North Shields connection continues to this day, with the recent casting of a bronze bust of our famous visitor by local born sculptor and art teacher Bethany Malcolm, whose parents still live in the town, with Newcastle City Library and prominent historian David Ulashuga sharing the crowdfunding page on Twitter. The £2,000 fund needed to produce the bronze was quickly raised. Now, with the support from the Douglas family in the United States, the completed piece will be displayed in Newcastle City Library once COVID-19 restrictions have been lifted. Let's leave the last word to the man himself.
In thinking of America, I sometimes find myself admiring her bright blue sky, her grand old woods, her fertile fields, her beautiful rivers, her mighty lakes and star-crowned mountains. But my rapture is soon checked when I remember that all is cursed with the infernal spirit of slaveholding and wrong, when I remember that with the waters of her noblest rivers, the tears of my brethren are borne to the ocean, disregarded and forgotten, that her most fertile fields drink daily of the warm blood of my outraged sisters. I am filled with unutterable loathing. Frederick Douglass.